it really interested us largely because Moreau was constantly saying school was not the right place for him, and he would just talk about how it was all wrong, the way they did things, at least for him, you know. And they told him what to do all the time, whereas he wanted to be able to follow, you know, his own interests and stuff like that, which is exactly what it said on this poster, that it would be a center for supporting young people to, you know, be homeschoolers legally, but then follow their own, you know, passions and interests and be supported by this place, which is now called North Star.
North Star was sort of starting up at the end of the summer after 5th grade. At this point I was pretty, I really wanted to leave, although I guess I hadn't really considered actually leaving. I just always thought I would hate it and just end up staying there, whatever. But I can't remember either if I met North Star first or if I read this book first. I ended up reading Grace Llewellyn's Teenage Liberation Handbook. That sort of opened my mind up, and I thought, wow, I could actually have a good life, like being outside of school. And then I went to one of the first sort of informational meetings about North Star. It sounded, really interesting and amazing.
I started North Star in 1996 with Joshua Hornick. We were both teaching at the Amherst Junior High School. I was teaching U.S. history, he was teaching science, both to 8th graders. And by that time, we had both become somewhat disillusioned with the process that we were engaged in.
Ken and I used to carpool, and we would have all kinds of complaints about how here are kids who are at a time of their lives when they're finding out who they are and how exciting life is, and they were just delving deeper and deeper into mediocrity and how do I get by without getting into trouble, or just what's the least amount of work I can do to get the grade which I've got to have so I can feel decent about myself, so that I won't be ashamed in our environment or our society.
In working through all of those thoughts, Joshua began to talk to me about homeschooling, and he had written about homeschooling for his master's thesis a little bit when he was becoming a science teacher. And he gave me a book to read called Teenage Liberation Handbook, How to Quit School and Get a Real Life in Education by Grace Llewellyn, which is sort of the standard book of our movement. And the book describes the experiences of a bunch of teenagers who never went to school. And lo and behold, they were pretty healthy kids who had interesting lives, animals and computers and theater and art and drama, and they all go off to college or start their own businesses or turn out well. I became pretty convinced that homeschooling was a reasonably healthy thing for a lot of kids who would do it during their teenage years. And I also became educated about homeschooling. I read a lot of books about homeschooling. I began to understand that homeschooling did not mean schooling at home. I understood that homeschooling did not mean parents teaching their children. It meant the family taking responsibility for the student's education and then creating the world and the curriculum and educational plan and lifestyle that meant the most to that teen and that family, and working out all the kinks and the debates about what's a meaningful life within the family. And as I began to understand how the homeschooling process worked, especially for teenagers, I became convinced that this was a really, really good idea. It's a really healthy way to live one's life, and that a lot of the kids I was teaching in the junior high would benefit by having a chance to live this lifestyle.
Came here, Ken, the director here, he talked to me and he said, well, what do you like to do? And I really, that was probably the first time anyone had asked me that, just because I never thought like that, outside, so then basically the first year I went here, it was basically, I was looking, just sort of exploring my options and trying to find something that I was really passionate about.
When I first came to North Star, when I had my so-called intake meeting, I don't know if they call it such a clinical thing, I sat down with Josh and Ken, and I remember it was in their very first space, so it's in this little teeny room upstairs in this office building in downtown Amherst. And there were a few other people kind of moseying around while my mom and I were talking to Josh about my curriculum. And, Josh would come, he'd be like, okay, English, the superintendent wants to see an English section. Name some books you want to read. And I would sit there and I would say, well, I want to read this, and well, I don't know, do you have any suggestions, Josh? And, he would say to the few other people in the room, anyone read any good books recently? And someone said something, and it sounded so interesting to me. And I just loved the kind of flexibility of that format, where here I was in this semi-formal intake meeting with Josh and Ken, yet already I was immersed in this community where I was getting all this feedback from just kind of people who just happened to be there.
When a student starts at North Star, we tend to meet with the student and his or her family, whoever is involved, and figure out what a curriculum will need to look like for this individual. There is no set curriculum. There's nothing like a set curriculum here. What a lot of people have to do, everyone who's under 16 has to report back to their school systems. So they have to show that they are developing skills in the traditional areas, in math and English and science and social studies, in phys ed.
Once a family joins North Star, and we've helped them deal with the legal side of homeschooling, then we have this whole center. We have the whole calendar of classes and activities and people and events happening at the center. It's all optional. Everything here is voluntary. Kids can come every day or one day a week, or not for a week at all. And they can come and go as they please during the days that they're here. And when they're here, they can do all the classes on the calendar, or they can socialize and have some tutoring or read on the couch. It's up to them to do what they want when they're here. Also at North Star, there's a lot of tutoring going on. We have a lot of adults, a lot of staff around. There's a lot of writing and math tutorials and things of that nature happening. Sometimes more idiosyncratic. I've had the economics of baseball with a young man last year.
There's always, I don't know how North Star attracts so many teachers, but they're showing up, several times a week. People call up and say, I want to teach a class on this. We're looking for interns here. And then, we just let everyone know that that's going on. And so sometimes they didn't know they had this interest until someone says, the local radio station just called and they're looking for interns. And someone goes, oh, I kind of like to do that. So they didn't really know that they had interest in radio. And it turns out they enjoy it once they go.
You only use the E, which means and if you're adding them together. But if you're
taking more.
Right, so you just say manus if you take them more. Okay? Yeah. Do you want to do more time? Or are you cool? Okay. Alright, so we can move on to the next page.
I think probably a really big difference between high school classes and North Star classes is that if you sat down and watched a North Star class, you probably wouldn't think that it would be really obvious to you that it was a high school class, mostly because of the way the teachers interact with the students. It's not like a teacher standing up there in front of the class that's like the king or the queen, and then everyone else is just kind of like, okay, yes, Mrs. So-and-so, like, we call them by their first names and smile and just like talk to each other like friends, and it's just more like someone you know who knows more than you about something who's helping you learn it. It's not like I'm in charge of you and all this like weird authority stuff.
It's more on a peer basis than it is in school, and you're not having, just basically it's taking the element of control away, and it's saying, all right, let's have a conversation as it's a more friendly environment.
When I taught in schools, the relationship always began with my being the teacher, with my being the boss, with my having an arbitrary authority and power of judgment over the students. And at North Star, that wasn't there. I had the natural authority that came with being somebody that had showed this student a better way to live their life. And if this student was interested in studying relativity, when they came to a class of mine where I'm teaching about relativity, then our relationship is one where I'm a teacher in a really deep and beautiful sense of it. That I'm the person who is expanding this person's worldview.